I felt tempted to respond immediately and presenting, of course, all my prejudices in solving these problems. But then I would have moved within the limits of normative political theory, and then I decided instead to deal with the present EU crisis, assuming that would fit into the scheme the broad analysis and frame of Wolfgang Streeck. As to the occasion of Claus' Offe's birthday, in spite of the devastating pedagogical record, let me just tell you from my professional experience, our shared professional experience, we are always trying to learn from our students and closer associates, and we never know, we being the older ones, we never really come to know what we indeed learned over the decades from those who were once supposed to learn from us. But I can say at this occasion that I am certain in one single case that I learned from Claus much more than vice versa. Now, during the almost 5 decades of his academic career, Claus Offe has consistently approached one path, at least among several other aspects, to democratic theory, namely, he looked at it from the angle of the state, that is, from national policymakers in capitalist democracies. He is chiefly interested in the structural limits of their range of action. How can they manage to avoid delegitimizing clashes between the systematic requirements for economic growth and the demands of democratic citizens? Presenting the problem in this format, Offe starts from 2 basic assumptions. First, liberal governments rely no less on taxes than on votes. We heard this elaborated just on a broader scene, and they must therefore satisfy the legal, infrastructural, and fiscal requirements for profitable investments, as well as the civic demands for equal liberties, social justice, status security, and for delivering, of course, public services and goods. Second, there is no mechanism for achieving an equilibrium between these competing and, in times of crisis, we heard about it, even incompatible demands. An example is provided by the present crisis of the European Monetary Union, which Claus has analyzed in terms of a triangle of constraints. On one side, there is the need to bail out failing financial institutions whose preferred clients are in turn the very same governments who save the banks. And on the other side, there is the impossibility on both raising taxes, which would burden the investors of the real, of the value-producing economy, and cutting government spending at the cost of social security, public goods, and so on. If you allow me, I have circulation problems, and I would like to sit down and while sitting there. I mean, contrary, let me just add this one sentence, contrary to the Marxian type of functionalism, this approach does not prejudge the direction of causal flows. For capitalist democracies, it is an empirical question whether and to what extent politics can either determine the framing conditions of the economic system or must adapt to its functional imperatives. Now, this is the same frame of the considerations we just heard. Policymakers occupy a special position in the political system besides the position of various other actors, but in rare cases, they can act in the different, more inclusive role of exponents of the political system as a whole, for instance, when they seek to extend the range of political power within the larger society. Frustrated attempts to regulate global financial markets in order to bring destructive operations of the banking system back under control are an obvious case in point at the present time. The chief obstacle, or one of the chief obstacles, and this is the only point I can add to the previous considerations, one of the chief obstacles to such attempt is political fragmentation, that is, the competition among nation states. States which jealously guard their prerogatives are reluctant to build new supranational capacities for political action, at least not at the cost of a transfer of sovereign rights. In the first part of my paper, I would like to recall recent steps of the European Council towards closer cooperation among member states, which leads to an increase in European executive power in the service of a market-conforming EU regime and at the expense of the autonomy of national parliaments. In the latter part, I will discuss the feasibility of a quite improbable alternative, which would require taking the hurdle of a further constitutional process. Many experts agree on the economic causes for the present fiscal crisis because devaluing the currency is not an option, and due to the lack of compensatory mechanisms such as labor force mobility across national borders or common social policy regimes, the difference in levels of competitiveness between member states has generated economic imbalances across the Eurozone in the past and will continue to do so in an increasing extent in the future. In a tangential response to this requirement to intervene into this unbearable crisis situation, the German government has pushed for and succeeded in achieving an agreement on joint efforts to pursue individual national austerity policies on procedures for a joint supervision of the implementation, and on sanctioning mechanisms in case of violations. Now let me just remind you of the three major flaws of this approach, which are openly discussed. First, the dictate of austerity policies repeats the strategic error of betting mainly on fiscal stability. Under present conditions, this pattern of policy coordination functions in the way of a more effective translation of global economic imperatives into the channels of national policies. That strategy is not only flawed for economic reasons, and it is not only disastrous in view of its social consequences. In addition, it is counterproductive when it comes to the goal of regaining political control over unbridled financial markets. Second, the idea of one rule system fits all does not match the need for differential political programs at different levels of economic development in the context of different economic cultures. Ordnungspolitik is necessary up to a point, but it is not a substitute for the flexible interventions of a European economic government, which has to acquire the leeway for freely disposing over a budget, however limited, of its own. Third, the fiscal pact sets the seal on the intergovernmental mode of regulating and monitoring parallel national policies. The technocratic architecture of that mode of governance was already introduced by the Euro Plus Pact on March 25, 2011. With this document, the European Council, the heads of the governments, by the way, an organ that has no formal legislative power within the Union. So the agreements are just informal. With this document, the European Council arrogates the right, first, to determine specific targets for the whole range of policies that affect the competitiveness of a national economy measured in unit labor costs, and second, to supervise how the Commission monitors their timely implementation. The rhetoric cannot disguise the intended practice based on informal agreements. The heads of the governments involved impose in the clear obscure of pressure from one side and willy-nilly submission from the other side their will on each of the national parliaments individually. If a crash can be avoided, we should probably expect European politics to continue in this post-democratic direction of an executive federalism. If my analysis holds, it's not my own, I get it from many sources, this course will rather aggravate than alleviate the economic imbalances within the Eurozone, while serving the short-sighted interest of the ruling elites in decoupling complex and far-reaching European agreements from suspicious domestic arenas. Today, Europe appears to be trapped in the dilemma of the simultaneous necessity and impossibility of a democratic deepening of the European institutions. Turning to the second part, what speaks against the feasibility of an alternative path that would lead, hopefully, to the creation of a transnational democracy at the core of a European Union that moves on into speeds, but of course remains open to further accessions. I will leave aside the normative argument that the mode of democratic legitimation cannot be extended beyond the reach of a nation state. This objection depends on an excessively narrow conception of democratic self-government, and I have discussed that elsewhere. The empirical argument, however, put forward, for instance, by Wolfgang Streeck, that it would take a long time to bring economies with different structures, levels of development, and cultural backgrounds into alignment is obviously of different weight. The examples of southern Italy and East Germany indicate that inclusion and assimilation is difficult to achieve even within a nation state. Getting different economic cultures to grow together is certainly a long-term project. But institutional change, which would be required for solving at least some of the problems, cannot wait unless the EU will break down under further crises. Even if we concede the constitutional and the economic feasibility of the integrationist project, we still face the main and immediate problem of the resistance of Eurosceptic majorities among the electorate in almost all of the EMU member states. You have read probably the last polls for Germany in yesterday's Frankfurter Allgemeine. If we were to imagine referenda being conducted on the alternative between more or less Europe, the two most polarizing and closely related issues would be first, the transfer of additional sovereignty rights, and second, the creation of a tax basis for a European economic government with redistributive implications. Let me take up two questions. Why should pro-European political parties have at all an interest in engaging in a risky political mobilization of their respective national constituencies around such controversial issues? And what reasons are there to expect that they, if they would, could succeed? I mean, these are the two questions I will deal with succeedingly. What could motivate political parties to reverse the technocratic mode of an ongoing elite project like the European Union? The Monnet method of diplomatic incrementalism flourished for decades in a particular context, but there are at least three reasons for assuming that this context has recently changed. First, the political class can no longer keep key European issues of the national agendas. The familiar segmentation of European politics from national arenas has already been undermined by the public reactions to the first intentions to establish the post-democratic type of executive federalism I have indicated. National parliaments and courts are already alarmed, and the national media are increasingly led to reveal the domestic impact of the fiscal arrangements to save the credibility of states and banks. An additional incentive is that citizens understand now a striking aspect, new aspect, of the present crisis. For the first time, the collapse of the financial system, which is now at the same time the most highly developed sector and the greatest beneficiary of global capitalism. I say for the first time, the collapse of the financial system has been averted, or at least retarded, only by the involuntary contributions of citizens in their political role as taxpayers. Politics, secondly, politics behind closed doors has until now benefited from trends towards greater political apathy. I mean, Wolfgang Streeck, you remember, mentioned it. But indifference vis-à-vis Europe was, until recently, a more broad-based phenomenon, including the better off and more highly educated strata of the middle classes, who as a general rule are less likely to abstain from political engagement. As soon as they feel affected by imposed austerity policies or burdened by the expectation of redistributive effects and come to ascribe their apprehensions to what is going on in Brussels, the lack of output legitimation will instead stimulate their interest in pushing for more input legitimation. Finally, there are symptoms of a shift in the tacit complicity between technocracy and populism and their mutual reinforcement. Besides self-destructive revolts and the alarming manifestations of well-organized right-wing cadres, new channels of a diffuse unrest are opening up. We can talk about examples. One of them, according to my reading, is the quite unusual arousal of public interest on an issue of no relevance whatever, Wolf and Gauck. Let us assume, I mean, you have to analyze the attitudes of the receiving, I mean, the people who receive that agenda, I mean. And then I think you can see that there is smoldering something underneath. Let us assume that was the first question. Let us assume that pro-European political elites come to realize that merely paying lip service to more Europe no longer works. Assuming they decided to organize campaigns on alternative futures of the European Union, would they have a chance to turn the tables? Over the decades, political elites left the finalité of European unification largely undefined. The nations involved met the projects with more or less benevolent indifference. For them, securing peace on a blood-stained continent was sufficient reason for unification. This now affords political parties the opportunity to frame and specify the diffuse issue in a long-term perspective. In the long run, the creditor nations too would benefit from a scheme of redistribution that burdens their budgets in the short run. But much more important is the opportunity to transcend the narrow economic focus of the present discussion and to place the alternative in a broader context in view of a complex project that touches on so many relevant aspects of national life. The pros and cons can be reasonably balanced only if the agenda is opened and kept open for the first time. So far, we had in no state a European election. I can go into that. Just we didn't have any. All these elections were on national tickets and on national agendas. Now, existing preferences, I think, might, with all reservations, be reversed, if you allow me, by the force of better arguments, if the agenda setters take into account, among many other aspects, at least the following 4 points of view. First, a shared history of conflicts and reconciliations can be a resource for constructing a common political culture. Certainly, the memory politics of nation states, and in Europe we have the first generation of nation states, I remind you, and that means it's terrible. They are also the strongest nation states in terms of their inside-looking traditions. Anyway, I am now arguing for the contrary. Decisive in the nationalist, of course, it can work both ways, either in a nationalist or in an integrative reading. But the focus on the alternative between either more or less Europe solicits, at least, in such campaigns, a mutual perspective taking which might promote the efforts of leading media to relate national views and to compare them with one another. We could see rare exceptions already in the case of Greece, in German papers, but also in France. I haven't seen the other ones. Now, secondly, let's look to the synergetic effects of a core Europe which remains open for other member states to join. In view of the well-documented future prospects of a small continent that will undergo a proportional decrease in population, economic output, and political weight, independent European nations will lose the strength both to implement their own cultural and political models and to wield influence in shaping a politically drawn and socio-economically stratified world society. Third reason, the extraordinary role of a democratic vote on democracy. A referendum on or election, it doesn't matter really, on the issue of whether to go ahead with or to halt further European integration is a procedure that turns democracy from a source into a topic, and this in a twofold sense. Such a vote would not only facilitate or inhibit a further step towards constitution making, and constitution making process is always reflexive in this sense. But secondly, such a referendum or such an election would imply a vote for or against the democratic empowerment of European authorities, which would thereby be enabled to use their power to rebalance the relation between politics and markets. Final reason, entering European domestic politics, notwithstanding their common commitment. Pro-European parties are still divided along familiar lines. While one side wants to secure democratic backing for a more effective pursuit of, let's say, broadly market liberalism, the other side aims to furnish the European Union with a supranational authority that they then could use for a desired regulation of markets and so on, which is possible only, if at all, on a continental scale. This debate, and that is my point in this context, this debate is of constitutional relevance because the programmatic liberal social democratic split, which would be repeated in all of the national campaigns, would for the first time cut across the lines of national alliances. It would open the door for a European domestic policy and provide a stimulus for the formation of a European party system. Gabriel already was campaigning for a law. These are the first indicators. Now, this is what I here present for discussion. Listening to this morning's discussion, one thing came to my mind that I self-evidently start, as most of us, I suppose, from the long-standing assumption that there won't be, that there cannot be a stable political regime without some normative legitimacy. I think we are approaching the point where we have to question this premise and where we have to ask to explain the mechanisms or the whole range that might well explain the Bulgarian situation. I think it is a question. If we really go ahead, the question is whether Bulgaria is the model for us or vice versa.
Thank you very much.